today's podcast episode, I want to talk about some common misconceptions that people either enter into discussion with, enter into a subreddit, bring to the table, whether they're curious or not, because there are a lot of people who are just trolls, and they don't particularly care. They're not interested in, let's say, becoming educated or clarifying a specific position. They just know that they have one, you know they have one, and it's a misconception, and yet they're not interested in reality in addressing it. All they want to do is be an echo chamber in that. I've encountered that. But I've also encountered individuals who are legitimately and genuinely curious and have had their paradigms change because somebody took the time to explain it to them in the back and forth dialogue and they were willing to engage, or there was some place that they could point them to from the written perspective, like say an article or a series or whatever. True to form, as this podcast is an extension of the website, there will be a series in the future specifically talking and dealing with almost every single union misconception or preconceived notion that people bring to the table. I want to have a landing page I want to create and have a landing page, a place that new members, prospective members, curious individuals and the like can actually go and, let's say, here is where you can read or, a podcast episode like today, and you can understand legitimate points and engage dialogue. You can read and you can listen. And if you are of an open mind, you can have your paradigms challenged and ultimately changed. Because what's interesting in a bad way to me is just how prevalent propaganda is. Now, I hold in my hand, for those of you who are just listening on the audio podcast, a cell phone. I actually have two of them. One of them is personal, one of them is work. And each one they're both more powerful than the computer that NASA used to land man on the moon. And we use this phone today 99.9% of the time for entertainment purposes. And I've said this multiple times in multiple podcast episodes, but it's not my intention to malign or smear people who reside in the humor space. I think laughter is one of the best medicines that we could absolutely hope for in that regard. However, we don't have gatekeepers of information anymore. The information is out there. We have to actually do the legwork now because we have access to the internet to navigate through misinformation or disinformation. And it's not an easy task, but it certainly is better than having an actual gatekeeper who would not want to give you the information at all because it would make their job, their life, whatever, more difficult. That's exactly what used to happen a lot of times with safety rules. Prior to the abundant usage from an internet perspective and web pages, the only way that a lot of individuals out in the field working found out about safety rules from, let's say, a governmental OSHA, MSHA perspective, there was a handbook somewhere that someone gatekept and did not want you to see because they don't want you knowing what the rules are so that you know what they're held to. It's the same exact thing when it comes to a lot of propaganda today. And yet we don't have gatekeepers because we have internet, but a lot of people will not take the time to navigate through and try and sift out between the misinformation and disinformation, because there's plenty of websites out there, mine included, that really take what I would say are deeper dives into the data and or anecdotal experiences and, converse and whatnot and put out things there. That's what this podcast mini series addressing the misconceptions, if you will, is going to be about. And propaganda. So we're going to talk before we get into the actual the misconceptions that I want to address on this particular podcast episode, I want to talk just really briefly and lay some foundational stuff about what we're really attempting to address. Yes, I certainly want to address the actual misconceptions that follow in this podcast episode. I want to talk about them, I want to highlight them, and I want to say, okay, this is not true, here's why it's not true, etc. But foundationally, what the attempt really is to do is to address the most powerful tools that people exert over others. The first one being propaganda. The fact that propaganda, I said this earlier, but the fact that propaganda is used and is as successful as it is today is almost mind-boggling to me. Because more often than not, we give authority from the verbal perspective or even the written word. I've seen numerous bits of propaganda that are dropped, and we don't have to bypass a gatekeeper anymore. All we've got to do is use the internet to do some really research, have some conversations with people, and many of the preconceived notions, in this case, from a union perspective, are dismissed outright. And so from a foundational perspective, that's what we're looking to address today. We're looking to address the most powerful weapon that disingenuous people use over individuals who might be interested in forming a union, primarily because job site conditions, exploitation, piss poor pay, etc. Propaganda. But propaganda, so I've said this multiple times in multiple conversations with people and on Reddit too. Propaganda is the first punch that is used. The second one following right behind it, and these two are a dynamic duo, is the power of doubt. Again, another article and another podcast episode, but the power of doubt is amazing because when you sow propaganda, propaganda gives doubt its power. Propaganda gives power to doubt, and it allows doubt to really take hold and really sow roots in. And while we can't specifically in every instance address the power of doubt, a lot of times we can delegitimize it by addressing the actual propaganda which fuels doubt. From a foundational perspective, when we start going through this mini series of addressing the misconceptions, and if you've got, you're in a conversational space and you want to point somebody to this podcast episode, by all means, I'd love to have a conversation with them, even if it is one way from a podcast perspective of addressing this. From a foundational perspective, that's what we're doing. Yes, we are addressing the misconceptions, but at the root of it all, I want to effectively talk about and deal with the propaganda and the power that it gives doubt. So with that in mind, we're going to address 3 or 4 specific talking points that individuals use from a propaganda perspective to sow seeds of doubt, and even for individuals who are the loudest in the room, who are often the most incorrect. They have preconceived notions, and they need their paradigms challenged so that they can stop sowing seeds of doubt, but also sow seeds of, they're just sowing misconception. They're talking about lies. They're not addressing truth. So let's get into it. Misconception or talking point, if you will, number 1. You could end up making less. This is a prominent talking point. It's probably not the most prevalent, but looking over my list of what I would say are common misconceptions, I think it's the stupidest one. It's really the dumbest one I think that people use. And here's why. This is a talking point that is primarily, it's not a misconception that a lot of people out on the streets have. It's not a misconception that people who are even anti-union typically have. This is typically a misconception that people bring to the table when they are trying to get you to vote no on a union drive, if you will. It's a ridiculous misconception. And the primary reason why it's a ridiculous misconception is because if it were true that you're going to end up making less, every single employer in this country would go union because they could save money. So it's a very disingenuous misconception, and I would say even an attempt to, misdirect individuals, because it's simply not true. And what's more, they know it. That's why propaganda is so effective, is because most people know that if I can say it a certain way or express it in a certain light, or if I can if I can use this specific piece of propaganda to sow seeds of doubt, I will have people hooked. And I will be able to whisper sweet nothings in their ear or write it on a piece of paper and say, you might end up making less. And because you're unsure, the individual listening to this, or you're just legitimately curious, and someone brings this talking point up and you have nowhere else, or at least you believe you have nowhere else to go to actually find out information when it comes to, could I end up making less? It's not true. And I just wanted to give you one or two specific statistics to highlight this, right? You could end up making less. So from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so this was a report done in 2023. Pretty surprising, at least to me, that they were able to get a report out, that wasn't 2 or 3 years behind. It's just last year. But they at least reported in 2023 that the average, now we're taking the country average, okay? Non-union would elect to say, okay, well, I made $1,090 a week, as opposed to a union member's $1,263. So in effect, then, to put another way, a non-union member, again, this is across all different trades, all different aspects, white collar, blue collar, all that stuff. A non-union member was paid 86% of what a union member got. Many, many instances and situations, circumstances, and even specific crafts make significantly more than that. I'll talk about my own skilled trades perspective for a second. Whether it's iron workers, whether it's pipe fitters, whether it's electricians, whether it's crane operators, whatever. I have yet to find a non-union worker that can stand up and say, I make more than a union member. Moreover, and this is going to be a good segue in a few minutes to another misconception or talking point, but it's also disingenuous because they don't take into consideration the benefits. So while I can't speak to the public space, I can certainly talk to those in the building trades. And those in the building trades, as far as a union's perspective, we're talking about iron workers again, pipe fitters, electricians, crane operators, etc. Those individuals have stellar health care. And this is not a misconception, but spoiler alert, anybody who tells you that just because you're young, you don't need health care is ridiculous. First off, young people are not as healthy as they believe they are. And, healthcare insurance is extremely important. And this is especially if you're going to have kids and a family. So, but they have good healthcare coverage. And we also factor in retirement. We're talking a defined contribution, which is your annuity or a 401k, as well as a defined benefit plan, which is a pension plan. Now, these are on top of your pay. So, for example, if you are an iron worker and you work for a non-union firm and you're getting paid, I'll just make it up, but you're getting paid $25 an hour and this is a big if, but if you have access to healthcare insurance, that's coming out of your $25. And if you have access to a retirement plan, I almost would guarantee you that it's just a 401k and that money is coming out of your pocket as well. Whereas a union iron worker, by comparison, his money on top of whatever he makes hourly, he will also have money put into health and welfare or health fund. He will also have money put into an annuity / 401k, as well as a pension plan that is on top of what he makes. So this idea, that misconception number one, that you could end up making less, is extremely incorrect and very disingenuous. That's usually sown from a union drive or a union perspective because people don't want you to even consider or think about it. And I'll address this with every single point going forward and every single episode, but allow me to say this one thing. It's not about money. It's about power. It's about power. Make no mistake about it, because many firms, and I'll have to address this in a separate podcast episode and article, but many firms spend enormous amounts of money with non-union consultancies, anti-union, I should say, anti-union advocacy and law firms. And these are consulting firms that just specifically, or, largely, all they do is union avoidance. And they are extremely good at what they do when it comes to propaganda and when it comes to doubt. So, in response to this, then, somebody needs to come along and address misconceptions, ergo, this mini podcast series. The idea that you could end up making less is ridiculous. If that were the case, you can bet your bottom dollar that companies would do this, because they can make a lot less. They can pay you a lot less. All right. Even if it is about power, they can pay you less and then still take power. They're not being truthful. This is a talking misconception, and it's the first one. All right. Number 2, unions will cost you more with dues. Right. It's not worth it. You're going to spend more money on dues. This is not what you want to do. You're going to make less anyway. Talking misconception point number 2. Here's why. Let's back it up for 1 second and let's have an open and honest discussion about what a union is. It's a from a trade union perspective. A union is really nothing more than a group of people coming together and are saying, we want better. That's it. It's that simple. There's nothing mystifying about it, although from a propaganda perspective, seeds of doubt are sown all the time. There's really nothing mystifying about it. It's a collection of people. So this idea that the union is this urethral thing that you got to pay dues to that'll make you end up making less. Listen, you are the union. The prospect, when you become a member, you are in a union, you are the union. That's really it. And this is a totally different podcast episode as well. But your union dues, they go to maintaining and continually advocating for you and your rights and your benefits and everybody else's that's in that union. The idea that unions will cost you more with dues is a bit disingenuous. It's not as disingenuous as you could end up making less, because that's a stupid argument. That's why I let off with it. But the idea that it will cost you more with dues it's not the case. Depending on, I don't know what, every union is different. So let me just say that right now. Every union is different. The building trades are different from the SAG unions, different from the Teamsters, they're different from the UAW. They're all different. But that's what your dues go to. Your dues, they're not just this vast wasteland, okay? They are there for the continual advocacy for better benefits, better wages, making sure things don't degress, which is what is continually used in the anti-union space. They don't like the fact that you've got power. They don't want people to have power. It's quite clear, and it's just as simple as that, which is a good segue into this third talking point, that you have to pay a union boss to work. I've heard this, or I've read this, either or, numerous times. The idea that, again, this is just sowing propaganda, which gives power to doubt. What do you mean I got to pay a boss to work? I'm not paying nobody to work. I'm not paying him my dues money to work. Really? This goes to show you the power that is in propaganda, which gives power to doubt. I don't want to have to pay a union boss to work. What are you talking about? Properly understood, the members, remember, you are the member. You've joined a union, you've elected to join, or you are the member. Okay? It's your dues money that is helping to fund and for the collective good and for the benefits and the pay and the job site conditions. Your business manager, if you will, works for you. He works for you. So this idea that you've got to pay a union boss to work, it's not only is it disingenuous, but the word boss, I think, is intentionally used here. I think the word boss is intentionally used to make it seem like he or she, your business manager, is, who manages the day-to-day business operations of the local or union, is your boss. When in reality, it's the opposite. They work for you. And there's a whole level of transparency that, I hope to have some business managers on this podcast in the next couple of months because I really want to have that dialogue and that discussion. But the reality is this: they work for you. They work for you. And this idea that you have to pay a union boss, I mean, it's an enormously erroneous assumption, but it goes to show you the power of doubt that is sowed by propaganda. It's amazing. I'm going to end on this particular point, number 4, because it seems fitting to do so when we start talking about having to pay a union boss to work. That's not the structure of the union. There are anti-union talking points that say unions are not democratic. And it certainly seems like that's the case. That's our talking point, right? When a union, quote unquote, boss, you have to pay dues to a union boss to work. It's not the truth at all. He works for you. More to the point about unions are not democratic. That's emphatically not true. So, and let me explain with an example. Most unions, the business manager position is going to be an elected position. I can't cover every single variable for every single union. I'm broad brushing, but for the most part, the business manager position is going to be an elected position. You know what that means? That means you vote. What does that mean? That means it's a democratic process. Check that out. And then on top of that, what happens is you're going to have different people that are going to run for different positions, whether it's executive board or a trustee that's going to look over the books, and we're going to get all financial audits and all this kind of stuff. This is an extremely democratic setup method organization. What is not democratic is the corporate structure. And I don't mean just in the large corporation sense. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about even at the smallest company you work for that could have just 10 guys. Those 10 guys aren't getting together and they're not voting who's going to be their foreman. They're not voting to be who's going to be their superintendent. That's not democratic at all. So it's especially heinous when that specific seed of doubt is sown by propaganda when they say unions are not democratic. It is not true. And it's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black because they are not democratically structured. And to sit and say that unions are not democratically structured is ridiculous. So there you have the first 4. This is going to be a mini series, but there you have the first 4 common misconceptions or talking points that I specifically want to address. Number 1, you could end up making less. This is not true. Data point after data point after data point, whether it's, and I specifically chose the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There are multiple examples that you could go through. Just a quick Google search will highlight a number of websites that have Economic Policy Institute is another one. They have graph after graph. I mean, that's a very robust, researchable website that has so much data, it's not even funny. But I chose a government organization to put out this 86%. A non-union worker makes 86% of what a union worker makes. Fast forward to number 2, which is unions will cost you more with dues. Not true. Talking point number 3, that's a misconception. You have to pay a union quote unquote boss to work. Not true. Business manager and everybody else is voted in, ergo, they are working for you, which is a good segue into point number 4 from a reiteration perspective that unions are not democratically structured. This is a ridiculous argument. But if you're not willing as an individual to take the time to really engage, right? Go to Reddit or have a conversation with somebody or listen to a podcast episode where someone is laying down some or dealing with some misconceptions, I should say, then you're going to miss the mark and you're going to be swept up in the propaganda that will then sow seeds of doubt and cause you to stay right where you're at in the same situation that you're in. And meanwhile, the unionized worker is making more, and you could be too. And the job site conditions that you could be making too. And I want to end this podcast with just this one little nugget that I think is going to really, I don't want to say put the nail in the coffin, but it's really going to highlight just how important this is. We could sit and fight and talk and argue over misconceptions all day long. We could sit and talk about it all day long. We can have dialogue. We can bask in our ignorance if we want to. But the reality is this: you can always make more money, but you can't get your time back. So is your time worth listening to a podcast, worth engaging in dialogue with someone? Is it worth someone helping you see just how erroneous the propaganda actually is, so that you could then better your life and your family's life? Because that's the reality of it. You can't get your time back. And a lot of men and women who belong to unions know this. They want better for themselves. They want better for their children. They want better for their families as a whole. And, I might add, they want better for their brothers and sisters in the union mindset. Chew on that for a little bit. Think about that. If you came to this podcast episode, you downloaded it and you were curious about it, and you're still a little on the fence, there will be more podcast episodes coming that specifically talk about some of these misconceptions and talking points. But I want to sow my own seed. And it's not the seed of doubt or propaganda. It's the point that is it's the most important asset you've got, and it's your time. Is it worth getting better in this life? Is it worth getting more? Is it worth coming together to collectively form to get the best that you can get, to navigate through the misinformation and disinformation, to find out what's true and cut through the propaganda? I say yes. So join me on this series as we talk about common misconceptions and talking points of the anti-union and live better. I will see you on the next episode.